One of my favorite comic books growing up was Hardware. It's probably one of the greatest comic books you've never heard of. Some of you probably have heard of Hardware. There was a collective of people who created a division at DC called Milestone. And within this division, they created a bunch of original black superheroes. And they came out with a bunch of good comic books, of which, in my humble opinion, Hardware was the superstar. He was like the or modern version of Iron Man, and it was really good. It didn't feel forced. That's the thing about Milestone that I really enjoyed. But many people don't know much about Milestone and definitely don't know much about Hardware. Now, Hardware was relaunched by DC Comics. I think it was early 2022. I actually have the first 3 issues. It was it wasn't terrible, but so there's nothing wrong with covering modern stories and events within comic books, like incorporating those modern stories and those modern events into your comic books. I don't have an issue with that as long as the story is actually good. I felt like to some degree the writing sort of used modern events as a crutch, like to pull an audience in, things that are polarizing that people are either really going to like or really going to hate. And I think the writer was hoping that everybody was just really going to love it. People may have loved it. I don't know. I didn't look to see what the sales were. I just know when I read it in comparison to the original Hardware, in my humble opinion, it wasn't as good. Now, that's just my opinion. I'm one guy. That doesn't mean anything. You may love the book. You may think it's the greatest book ever, just like I loved the original Hardware. I think I have the first 6 original issues somewhere over here in my comic book collection. I may pull it out at some time this week and read it again just because it was that good. But Wildstorm was actually a good effort. There are some videos on YouTube. I believe there's a documentary about Milestone Comics. Don't quote me on that, but I know I watched something not too long ago and it went over the history of Milestone Comics and it was actually pretty good. First thing I wanted to do is kind of go over some information about Hardware if you've never heard of Hardware. Now, if you can get your hands on it, I'm pretty sure there's some places online you can go to and buy the older versions of this comic book. I highly recommend it. I think even the art was good, and even by today's standards, this would be a very good storyline. Storylines in the 90s were more pure. Writers just wanted to grab your attention with a good story. They really didn't care about much else. Now, at some point, that kind of died off, and there was a specific time where it was just big, bulky, muscular superheroes with no story, and that was I want to say that was headed toward what's known as the Great Comic Book Crash. The comic book market was saturated. If you don't know much about what happened then, there was a craze because of what happened with people that had earlier versions or first issues of Batman and Superman and how much money they went for. And there was this craze to print a bunch of comic books because everybody thought they were going to get rich. But there's several things they didn't account for. During World War II, if I'm not mistaken, fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure I have this information correct. There was paper needed for the war effort. Now, back then, comic books weren't looked at as anything great, and people donated comic books for paper. Comic books were thrown away, and many of the first issues of Batman and Superman just were not kept. So there's a limited amount of those issues. So those things are worth a lot of money. This is part of comic history. Comic books are often looked at and viewed as the American mythos, right? Romans have their their myths and legends. Greeks have their myths and legends. And in the United States, we have our myths and legends in comic books. And so moving forward in the 90s, many people thought they would capitalize on that hype, and they thought they would collect a bunch of books and they would be worth a bunch of money. The problem was a lot of these comic book companies oversaturated the market, printed so many copies of number ones, printed alternate copies because there was a craze. People were buying comics. Comics were selling like crazy. I believe Jim Lee's version of the X-Men, which he first penciled, I want to say in like 90 or 91. X-Men number one, I believe, sold something like 20 million copies, something crazy. Something that if a comic book company sold that many copies of a number one today, think about that. This is in the early 90s, 20 million copies. Now, granted, comic books were cheaper back then. Not by much, $1.25. I think on average I'm paying $3 for a comic right now. So yes, it is considerably more, but just relatively speaking, comic books are not really that expensive. Anyway, I'm going to get into, I went all over the place. I want to get into some stuff about hardware. So this article is on CBR.com. The title is Milestone Comics, Every Weapon in Hardware's Arsenal Ranked. I'm not going to read this whole thing, just going to, kind of skim through, go through some points, give you a little brief introduction of hardware. Curtis Metcalf became one of Milestone Comics' first heroes as the Armored Hardware. He stole the resource of Alva Industries to create the hardware armor so he could bring down the company's criminal operations. Metcalf designed a few different versions of his armor, improving hardware's arsenal with each new model. And as I said, he was like Milestone's version of Iron Man. But I really liked hardware a lot more. And it's not just because he was black. Again, this was back during a time where the focus, yes, they wanted to create new and interesting black superheroes. But you'd be surprised because the focus never felt like it was on the fact that they were black superheroes. Yes, obviously they were black and the creators were black, but they were good. And I think that may be a big difference between then and now. I'm not saying there's not good black creators and good black superheroes now. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the focus now may be more on the fact that these heroes are black and less on the fact of a good story and good art. I'm not saying across the board. I'm just saying generally speaking, I think that may be the difference between then and now. Hardware used an advanced shell made of polarized liquid metal that served as the foundation for the external armor components. He had a powerful jetpack and a flying car known as the Skylark, also all operated by an onboard computer system known as Dolby. However, hardware really stood out in the Dakotaverse due to the firepower and various weaponry built into his armor. And it goes into a little bit of his weapons. If you're watching the YouTube video, it's showing some panels from the hardware comic book. And I'm not telling you that this art was the most mind-blowing art, but it was good. It was good art, especially for the 90s, and I enjoyed it. Now, here's one of my favorite shots of hardware right here. I remember reading this book, and I remember seeing this shot, and I remember thinking to myself, man, this is a dope comic book. It says the chains and sickle he wore were low tech but incredibly effective, and they were. When he used those in battle, it was amazing. Curtis Metcalf designed a number of impressive weapons for his hardware armor. However, he also equipped the suit with some reliable physical weaponry in case his other tech was broken or ineffective. The thick and heavy chains were attached to Hardware's belt. These could be used for a number of both offensive and defensive purposes. Hardware, so it's hard to convey in this article, and it's hard to even convey in the pictures if you've never read the original comic books, which is why I say if you can get your hands on about Hardware number 1 through number 5, the 90s version, I believe it came out in 93, I would definitely go get the book and read it. It feels like a mix of Iron Man and Batman. Hardware was Curtis Metcalf was extremely smart, brilliant, an excellent fighter in the book. That's how he was portrayed in the book, and just always figured out a way to defeat his opponents, similar to Bruce Wayne. And I think it was actually a very good mix. I believe those were the influences behind the creation of this character. And now I'm going to read you a little bit about the creation of Milestone comic books, or Milestone Comics. The comic book business has changed drastically over the last few decades, especially on the creative side. There is more representation in the panels and subsequently on a small and silver screens than there ever have been more. On the other side of that same token, the faces of the people who write, draw, and color these characters to life every month are also changing, although it's taken much longer than it should have, and there's still miles yet to come in terms of Black, Brown, Asian, and women creators of all different kinds of sexual identities and blah, blah, blah. Not going to get into all of that. I'm not concerned with all that. I'm just concerned with going over the history of Milestone Comics and how it was created. Let's see. Get down here. Okay, founded by Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cohen, Derek Dingle, and Michael Davis in 1993, Milestone made history in a deal with DC Comics that was unheard of, especially for Black companies. McDuffie's crew signed a publishing deal that gave DC the right to limited license of the characters, editorial work, and other creative content that came out of Milestone, but the company retained complete editorial control as well as the copyrights. So that's a pretty good deal, especially for the 90s. These dudes were definitely on top of their game. Milestone had the last say on all merchandising and licensing. Hold on, my computer's going crazy. Licensing in regards to properties they created. It's been noted that DC Comics officials were often uncomfortable with Milestone storyline arcs in the books, but because of the deal they signed and the accomplishments of the company's founders in the comic book mainstream, almost all the issues they wrote saw the light of day and sold just as many books or more than every Black comic company releasing content at the time combined. And I think that just goes to show you create a good product, people will like it. And that's what it was for me. It wasn't back then for me. It wasn't necessarily that it was a Black comic book created by Black creators, because at the time I started reading the book, I had no idea that these were Black creators. I didn't know. I just knew there was this new book, Hardware, from DC Milestone Comics, and it was great. And I could not wait for every new issue to come out. I remember there was a store that I would go to down the block from me, a little bodega there in Brooklyn, and they had like a comic book rack. It wasn't even a full comic book store. It was just a bodega that had a comic book rack. I'd get off the bus, the B12, coming home from school, and I'd go to that store to see if there was a new issue of hardware. And every time there was a new issue, I saved up my little pennies and I bought that book every time, and I was super excited. Further reading the article, but McDuffie and his partner's journey doesn't start at Milestone Comics. His very first gig in the business was as an assistant editor of Marvel Comics under Bob Budiansky. I know I pronounced that name wrong, for special projects. And one of the projects that began his comic book career was helping the company develop the first superhero trading cards. From there, McDuffie went on to become editor at Marvel in his own right. But he and his employer didn't always see eye to eye. And he had a very unique way of making his disagreement with them known, to bring light internally to his feelings about Marvel's treatment of black characters. At the time, McDuffie submitted a spoof proposal comic named Teenage Negro Ninja Thrashers. That is hilarious. And I believe McDuffie, it says he passed away in 2011. He actually, here's the interesting thing. He actually worked on, if I'm not mistaken, a bunch of things for Nickelodeon, a bunch of their cartoons. But yeah, Milestone Comics, to comic geeks, you probably already know about this. To those who were never into comic books, you probably didn't even know this existed. And then I'm telling you, in the 90s, man, Milestone Comics, Milestone Comics, my bad. I said Milestone. I'm conflating two different comic book companies. Milestone Comics was amazing. Like I said, Static Shock, I never really read, and I didn't really. So they had Static Shock, Icon, which was like a kind of version similar to Superman, Blood Syndicate, and Hardware. I was primarily a fan of Hardware. That's what I read. I think I might have some older Blood Syndicate comics, if I'm not mistaken, and I might have an Icon or two laying around. But great comic books you don't really hear about often. It kind of bums me out that the reboot wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, and I was excited when I found out it was being rebooted. I was so excited. But I read the first couple issues of Hardware, and I was like, if it keeps going, I'll give it some time. That's the thing. I think a lot of comic book companies, they end too quickly. I understand you got to make a profit. If you don't turn a profit, you got to let things go. I get it. It's the business. But it's kind of sad, because I think some comics, if you would just give it time, would gain legs. But I think what they have to do is focus more on really good and dynamic stories. I don't really so much care about the views of the writer or whoever is, drawing the book or inking the book. I don't really care about that too much. But if the story is good and it keeps me coming back, and I want to, come back for the next issue, man, I'm on board with it. But Milestone Comics, I wish it would come back with a bang. We'll see what's going to happen.